You're not going to believe what happened when the HOA tried to control my property, even though I'm not part of their neighborhood. They called the cops, accused me of violations, and ended up paying for my porch. This isn't fiction. This is real life, and it's one of the wildest homeowner stories you'll ever hear. Let's dive in. I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard a knock that changed everything. I opened the door to two uniformed police officers and a woman with a clipboard who looked like she hadn't smiled since 1998. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints about violations on your front porch," one officer said. "Violations? Porch? What?" Confused and slightly amused, I asked, "From who?" That's when she spoke up. "The Homeowners Association." Now here's the kicker. I'm not even part of the HOA. I live on a rural ranch property I've owned for 10 years, and I made sure when I bought it that it was outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. Yet here they were, on my doorstep, with the police trying to enforce rules that don't apply to me. And that was just the beginning. I looked from the clipboard woman to the officers, waiting for someone to explain how exactly an HOA, which had no authority here, had managed to rope in law enforcement. The officer cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, are you sure this property is within your HOA's boundaries?" She snapped back with bureaucratic certainty. "According to the revised map and the new charter voted in last month, this parcel now falls within the extended perimeter." I blinked, stunned. Revised map? I never got notified about any charter vote or extension. This is private land. The second officer, younger and less enthusiastic, seemed unsure. "Sir, maybe we can sort this out civilly. Do you mind if we take a quick look at the porch?" I hesitated, mostly out of disbelief, then nodded. "Fine, but I want this on record. I don't recognize the HOA's authority here." We walked around to the porch, where admittedly, I had a few things that might not have passed muster. In a tightly regulated neighborhood, a rusty old smoker I was refurbishing, a vintage clawfoot bathtub I planned to turn into a planter, and a carved wooden bear statue holding a shotgun that made most people either laugh or frown. The clipboard lady clicked her pen aggressively and muttered to herself as she jotted notes. "Unapproved lawn ornament, non-functional fixture, hazardous item display." I shook my head. "That's a piece of art. That tub is going to have geraniums. And that smoker? That's a piece of Texas barbecue history." She didn't look up. "Regardless, they're in clear violation of the community aesthetic guidelines." "There is no community," I snapped. "Not for me." "I'm not in your HOA." She finally looked up, her mouth a thin, grim line. "That may have been true 10 years ago, but boundaries shift. We now include all properties within a 2-mile radius of the Cedar Ridge development." I laughed, but it came out harsher than I intended. You can't just redraw lines and impose rules on landowners without consent. The older officer nodded slowly. "He's got a point. You'd need legal authority, and even then you'd have to prove notification." Clipboard lady's eyes darted. "Well, we posted notices." "Where?" I asked. "I check my mail every day. Never got a thing." "We placed flyers at the local gas station." "You mean the one 12 miles from here?" She huffed. "That's the central posting location for rural notifications." "I don't think so," I said, "and I'll be calling my lawyer." That's when the younger cop stepped forward and, to his credit, lowered his voice. "Sir, we're just here to keep the peace. No one's pressing charges, but if there's a dispute, we suggest you settle it with the HOA through civil channels." "There is no dispute," I said. "They have no jurisdiction. This isn't a matter of policy. It's a matter of property law." I turned to clipboard lady. "You, step foot here again without a court order, and I'll consider it trespassing." Her face flushed red. "You'll be hearing from us." "You can send a letter," I replied, "and I'll have my attorney wipe his boots with it." The police left shortly afterward, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, and she trudged off to her hybrid SUV with a bumper sticker that read, "A clean neighborhood is a happy neighborhood." I stood on my porch for a while, looking out over the acres of open land I'd worked so hard to maintain. This place wasn't a manicured cul-de-sac or a row of matching houses with identical shutters. It was real, raw, and mine. That night, I dug through my paperwork, found the original deed, and pulled up the county zoning maps. No mention of any HOA, no amendments, no boundary changes. I called the county office the next day and confirmed it. My property was as independent as it had been a decade ago. I asked them to send written confirmation, which they did, and then I mailed a copy with a little note of my own to the HOA president. But that didn't stop them. A week later, I received a final notice in the mail, a printed letter, on HOA letterhead with a long list of supposed violations and a threat of fines totaling over $3,000. The nerve. I contacted a property rights attorney who laughed when I showed him the documents. "They've got no leg to stand on," he said. "They're trying to bluff you into compliance." So I sent a cease and desist letter through my attorney and posted a large sign at the edge of my driveway. "Private property, not subject to HOA regulations." It was only then that the harassment stopped, at least officially. But I started noticing strange things. My mailbox was knocked over 3 times in 1 month. Someone left a stack of HOA newsletters under a rock on my porch. One morning, I found tire tracks where someone had driven onto my lawn and made donuts in the dirt. Coincidence? Maybe. But I wasn't taking chances. I installed cameras, reinforced my mailbox post with concrete, and let my 2 dogs roam the yard freely. Weeks passed and the silence settled in, but something had changed. What had been a quiet life on a peaceful ranch now had a subtle tension in the air, like a guitar string pulled too tight. I still drank my coffee on that same porch, next to the smoker and the old tub that now bloomed with flowers. The wooden bear still held his shotgun. And me? I held my ground. Because in a world that's always trying to box you in, sometimes the only way to stay free is to stand firm. Porch violations be damned. Let me paint the picture. My porch had seen better days. A few cracked boards, peeling paint that flaked off like autumn leaves, and an old rocking chair that had been through one too many rainstorms, its joints groaning when you sat in it like an old man settling into a hot bath. But it wasn't dangerous. It wasn't falling apart. It was just rustic. That's the charm of a ranch, right? A little grit, a little wear, a little history soaked into the wood like years of spilled whiskey and sweat. It had character, but apparently the HOA disagreed. According to their representative, the same clipboard-wielding woman with the scowl frozen on her face like it was carved there by time, my porch was a visual nuisance to the neighboring properties, which, she explained, had all joined the HOA voluntarily. Somehow, in her twisted logic, that collective decision meant that I, a non-member who deliberately bought land outside of any HOA's reach, was now subject to their so-called community standards. They even accused me of violating community uniformity, which is rich considering I don't live in their community. I live on 5 acres of open land, with no fences touching theirs, no shared roadways, and no contracts tying me to their manicured little fantasy. My ranch is set back nearly half a mile from the road, with oak trees, grazing fields, and a view of the hills that makes most people pause and breathe a little easier. But not her. She saw cracked paint and a weathered chair and deemed it an eyesore. So why the police? Because the HOA filed a formal complaint, accusing me of refusing compliance and, get this, creating a safety hazard. That turned their nonsense into a public safety call, which meant law enforcement was required to respond. That's how I ended up with 2 officers on my front step, standing beside a woman who looked like she ironed her socks and ate granola for dinner. They took a look around, gave a quick shrug, and the older one said, "This isn't a safety hazard." He tapped the floorboards with his boot, listened to the sound, then stepped back and said, "Nothing here's going to hurt anyone. You've got some cosmetic wear, but that's not a crime." Then, to my amazement and increasing irritation, the lady from the HOA had the audacity to argue with the police. On my land. "Officer," she said, with a condescending tone that probably worked on room temperature compliance officers, but clearly grated on these guys, "if you consult the HOA guidelines, Section 4B states that any structure visible from a neighboring property must maintain community aesthetic standards. His porch is clearly visible from 2 HOA member homes. The older officer looked unimpressed. Ma'am, guidelines from a homeowners association don't override property laws. This man isn't part of your HOA. She stiffened like she'd swallowed a ruler. But with the recent boundary vote, his land now falls within the expanded radius. A radius doesn't mean jurisdiction, the officer replied. He didn't sign anything. He didn't consent. You can't impose rules on private property without legal standing. She huffed, color rising in her cheeks, and pulled out a folder thick with papers. I have documentation, she snapped, holding it out like it was some holy text. Then take it to court, the younger officer said, folding his arms. But this is a civil matter, not a safety one. We're not here to enforce HOA drama. I nearly laughed out loud at that, but I kept my mouth shut. No sense making it worse, though I did step forward and say, You're trespassing now. I asked you to leave once already. The officer nodded. Ma'am, I think it's time to go. She hesitated, glanced around the porch again like she might find some additional piece of damning evidence, then clutched her folder to her chest like a life raft. You haven't heard the last of this, she muttered. We're protecting property values. You're wasting everyone's time, I shot back. And for the record, this porch has more soul than any of those identical stucco boxes down the road. She turned on her heel and stomped off, the officers trailing, behind her, clearly ready to be done with the nonsense. I watched them go, still amazed that anyone would go so far out of their way to control something that didn't belong to them. The next day, I got a certified letter, a formal citation from the HOA for non-compliance, including photographs of my porch, descriptions of alleged violations, and a schedule of fines beginning at $500 per day until I restored community standards. I brought the letter to my attorney, a no-nonsense woman who'd defended rural landowners for decades. She looked it over, laughed, and said, They've got nothing. No contract, no easement, no jurisdiction, but they're betting you'll cave to the pressure. She helped me draft a cease and desist letter, complete with threats of legal action for harassment and trespassing. We sent it by certified mail. I also added a new sign to my porch, hand-painted in red. Private property. HOA not recognized. Trespassers will be prosecuted. It was dramatic, sure, but I wanted the bye message to be clear. I wasn't backing down. I wasn't sanding my boards or buying a new chair or repainting just because someone down the road thought my home didn't match their neighborhood magazine dreamscape. Over the next few weeks, I kept an eye out. Saw her car drive by more than once. Got another anonymous complaint filed with the county, which turned out to be baseless. The inspector actually complimented the craftsmanship of the porch when he visited. He even asked about the wood stain I'd used 10 years ago. I realized this wasn't just about aesthetics or standards or even power. This was personal. Someone, or maybe a group of someones, had decided that they didn't like having a piece of authenticity in view of their perfectly trimmed lawns. They wanted uniformity, obedience, a neighborhood that looked good in drone photos. But this isn't a neighborhood. It's my ranch, my home, and I'm not going anywhere. So I sit on that rocking chair every morning, coffee in hand, dogs at my feet, and watch the sun rise over the hills. The boards creak, the paint flakes a little more, but it's still standing strong. Just like me. After that surreal encounter, I decided to dig into what rights this HOA thought they had, because something just didn't sit right. I've lived on my ranch for over a decade, deliberately avoiding subdivisions, restrictive covenants, and everything that comes with an HOA. I bought this land with the explicit purpose of being free from that nonsense, of having a place where I could do things my way, where a rusty rocking chair wasn't a violation but a reminder of slow afternoons and honest living. So when they came knocking, clipboard in hand and police in tow, I knew something wasn't adding up. I went online, dug through county records, and called a few neighbors. That's when the full story came into view. Turns out the HOA had recently expanded, or at least tried to. They sent out glossy pamphlets with pictures of pristine lawns, kids on bikes, and carefully worded promises about increased property values, improved infrastructure, and greater community cohesion. Along with those came updated agreements, legal-looking but just vague enough to confuse people. Many of my neighbors signed without reading the fine print, drawn in by the idea that someone else would handle potholes, enforce quiet hours, and keep the riffraff out. Some even thought it was mandatory, but it wasn't, not even close. These were voluntary agreements dressed up like requirements. I didn't sign, never plan to, never will. And yet, because my property sits right on the edge of their newly proposed boundary, land they claimed as part of their influence zone, they decided that I should be folded in too. Not through any legal channel, not by any contract. I'd agreed to, but by pressure. They figured if they sent enough letters, showed up with enough officials, and threw around words like non-compliance and violations, I'd eventually roll over and fall in line. Spoiler alert, I didn't. Instead, I got smart. I recorded everything. The visit from the police, the woman from the HOA arguing with them on my porch, the phone call I received the next day from some overly cheerful community coordinator asking me to reconsider my position for the good of the neighborhood. Even the follow-up letter with grainy pictures of my porch and a demand to remedy the aesthetic defects within 14 days. I kept meticulous notes, time-stamped recordings, and copies of every document. Then I did what anyone in this day and age would do. I posted about it in a local Facebook group. Just a short summary at first, a "you won't believe this" kind of post, accompanied by a photo of the clipboard lady standing stiffly at my gate. I figured a few people might react, maybe share their own HOA gripes. But I underestimated just how many people around here had also felt the heavy hand of this overreaching organization. The post blew up. Hundreds of comments rolled in. People from down the road, the next town over, even folks who had already signed the new agreements and were regretting it chimed in. Some shared stories of surprise fines, citations for having unsightly flower beds, letters about unapproved curtain colors, and even a guy who got a warning for having a vintage truck parked in his own driveway. A pattern emerged. This wasn't about safety or order or neighborly living. This was about control. The HOA was flexing its muscles, trying to bring as much land under its thumb as possible, and banking on the idea that most people wouldn't push back. But I did, and now, thanks to that post, I wasn't alone. I started getting messages. One woman down the road had a letter stating that she had to remove a swing set because it clashed with the community tone. Another man said he'd received 3 warnings for his mailbox being too rustic. A retired couple told me they'd signed the agreement thinking it was for road maintenance, only to realize they'd unknowingly given the HOA power over their landscaping choices. And every one of them asked the same thing. What can we do? So I told them what I was doing. I spoke with my lawyer again and got confirmation in writing. My property wasn't under the HOA's jurisdiction. I shared a template for a cease and desist letter. I explained how to look up parcel records and compare them to the HOA's claimed boundaries. I encouraged people to request copies of anything they signed and actually read the terms. Some were shocked by what they'd agreed to. Others realized they hadn't agreed to anything and were being intimidated anyway. The more noise we made, the more the HOA backed off. Not publicly, of course. They maintained their smiling, bureaucratic tone in every letter and message, but their demands stopped coming. They quit sending representatives to my property. They stopped threatening fines. I kept posting updates. I shared screenshots of the letters, audio clips of the calls with any identifying information redacted, and pictures of my porch with the caption, "Still standing, still mine." It became a rallying point, a strange little symbol of resistance, for people who felt like they were losing control of their own homes. What started as an isolated conflict on my porch turned into a local movement. A few of us even met up at the diner one Saturday morning, sipping burnt coffee and trading stories. We talked about forming a landowners alliance, pooling resources, for legal advice, and standing up to overreaches like this together instead of alone. The HOA had made a mistake. They'd tried to scare a rancher into submission. Instead, they woke up a community that had gotten too used to saying yes out of convenience. Now we were saying no, not out of anger, but out of principle. Because a man's home isn't just where he hangs his hat, it's where he sets his terms. And when someone tries to move those terms without your consent, the only right response is to dig in your boots and make it clear. Not here, not now, not ever. My post went viral. Well, as viral as anything can get in a local Facebook group, where people mostly post about lost pets, church bake sales, and which grocery store finally got restocked on decent avocados. But in our little corner of the world, it absolutely exploded. Hundreds of comments came pouring in over the course of a few days. People were furious, baffled, entertained, and above all, fed up. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd had a run-in with the overzealous HOA, though I might have been the first to turn it into a public spectacle. Some folks admitted they'd signed the HOA agreement without reading it, thinking it was just another harmless neighborhood initiative, only to find out later that they'd essentially sold the soul of their property for the promise of community cohesion. Others hadn't signed anything at all and were still receiving threatening letters about non-compliance. The real kicker: several of my own neighbors who had previously defended the HOA started having second thoughts after reading my story. They reached out privately and even commented publicly, saying they'd had similar concerns but hadn't spoken up. One guy, a retired veteran down the road, told me he got a warning for leaving his American flag up overnight. Another woman shared that she'd been told her daughter's birthday decorations were inappropriate for the visual standard of the block. You can't make this stuff up. But here's where it takes a hilarious twist, something so absurd that I actually laughed out loud when it happened. After the backlash reached a fever pitch and the HOA realized their attempt to shame me had backfired spectacularly, they tried to save face. Out of the blue, I got a formal letter, on glossy letterhead and everything, offering me a so-called courtesy grant for home improvement. The reason given? They wanted to make a gesture of goodwill to improve community aesthetics. That's their exact phrase. A gesture of goodwill. From the same people who brought the cops to my porch over chipped paint and a creaky rocking chair. From the same woman who argued with the police on my property about community standards that I was never part of. Translation: they realized they messed up and were trying to sweep it under the rug without admitting fault. Now, I'll be honest. My first reaction was pure stubborn pride. I was ready to tell them where they could shove their courtesy grant. I don't like being bought, and I especially don't like the idea of accepting money from people who tried to bully me into submission just weeks prior. But then, as I sat on my porch with my coffee, same chair, same view, same chipped boards, I started thinking, why not? Why shouldn't I take their money? They'd spent weeks trying to make my life difficult, trying to enforce rules that didn't apply to me, trying to use their illusion of authority to pressure me into conforming to their sterile, suburban ideal. And now, not only had they failed, but they were offering to foot the bill for the upgrades they'd tried to force. So I took the check. I cashed it with a smile on my face and used every last cent to give the porch a facelift. Not because they told me to, but because I wanted to. I hired a local carpenter who specializes in reclaimed wood and had brand new decking installed, smooth and solid, and built to last another 20 years. I added a stylish railing that still fits the rustic charm of the ranch, just with a bit more polish. I bought 2 new rocking chairs to match the one I'd eventually retire, got a handmade porch swing hung from thick chains, and added some comfortable outdoor cushions that won't fade in the sun. I even splurged on some string lights and a couple of potted plants just to really lean into the aesthetic. And you know what? The place looks incredible. People driving by stop to compliment it. Friends who hadn't visited in a while say it. Looks like something out of a magazine. My porch has become a gathering spot, a quiet, welcoming space with a view of the hills and enough charm to make anyone feel at home. And it's all thanks to the HOA, the very people who wanted to tear it down. The irony is so rich I could bottle it and sell it. They tried to force my hand with threats and bureaucracy. They sent letters, warnings, and even police officers to my doorstep. And when that didn't work, they resorted to bribery disguised as charity. But instead of getting their way, they ended up paying for something they never had a say in to begin with. It's like losing a chess game, flipping the board, and then handing your opponent a trophy out of spite. And the best part is, I'm still not part of the HOA. I never signed their agreement, never gave them an inch of legal ground to stand on, and they know it. Which means that Porch, the porch they paid to upgrade, remains fully and entirely under my control. If I want to paint it purple next year, I can. If I want to let the rocking chairs rust again, I can. But for now, I'm just enjoying the peace. I sit out there every morning, cup of coffee in hand, dogs snoozing at my feet, watching the sun rise and the light dance across the newly oiled wood. It's a victory that tastes better with every creak of the swing and every breath of that clean country air. Sometimes people ask me if I feel like I sold out by accepting their money. And I tell them no, not even a little. I didn't compromise my principles. I didn't back down. I didn't change a single thing out of obligation. I did what I wanted, when I wanted, and they just happened to pay for it. In the end, it wasn't about the porch. It was about standing your ground, about knowing your rights and not being intimidated by people who count on silence and compliance. And maybe, just maybe, about showing that sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight harder. It's to let them dig their own hole and then build yourself a brand new front porch right on top of it. So what's the takeaway? It's simple, really, but somehow still lost on certain people drunk on authority they don't actually have. If you're going to enforce rules, you better make damn sure those rules apply. The homeowners association in my area learned that lesson the hard way, and I was more than happy to be the one holding up the mirror. See, HOAs aren't inherently evil. They can serve a purpose for communities that agree to be part of them. They maintain lawns, handle shared spaces, make sure one neighbor doesn't paint their house neon green while another builds a chicken coop next door to someone trying to sell their home. Fine. If you live in that kind of neighborhood and you voluntarily sign the paperwork, then you're bound by their rules. But that's not me. That was never me. I live on a rural ranch, property far from the cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns and approved mailbox designs. I chose this life deliberately because I value independence more than conformity. When I bought this land over a decade ago, I made sure, legally and geographically, that it was outside of any HOA jurisdiction. So imagine my surprise when they showed up at my front porch like deputized hall monitors, clipboard in hand, police in tow, ready to hand down judgment like I was some wayward tenant in their suburban fiefdom. Their claim? That my porch was a visual nuisance and a violation of community aesthetics. My porch. The same porch that had been standing long before their newly expanded HOA ever existed. The same porch that wasn't visible from the main road and certainly didn't pose any safety risk beyond the occasional splinter if you happened to fall asleep in the rocking chair with your feet up. But no, they insisted it was non-compliant. Not that I ever agreed to comply in the first place. And when I refused to play along, they tried to escalate, called it a public safety issue, brought the cops, filed complaints. All bark, no bite. The police shrugged and left. The HOA lady argued with them on my property, and I stood there, bemused, sipping my coffee. But I didn't just let it go. I documented everything. I posted in a local Facebook group thinking a few neighbors might get a kick out of the absurdity. Instead, I struck a nerve. The post took off like wildfire, shared, commented on, screenshotted, and reposted. Hundreds of people chimed in, some in disbelief, others with their own HOA horror stories. The tide turned quickly. Even some neighbors who had recently signed on to the new HOA expansion started questioning their decision. People started checking property lines, asking for copies of the agreements they had blindly signed, and discovering just how much power they had inadvertently handed over. That alone was satisfying, but it got better. Faced with mounting public embarrassment and a spiraling PR nightmare, the HOA attempted to put the fire out with a gesture of goodwill. They offered me a so-called courtesy grant to fix up my porch. Their language was carefully crafted, but the subtext was clear. They realized they had no legal ground, and instead of admitting they'd overstepped, they tried to make the problem disappear with a check. They couched it in the language of neighborly support, of course, as if they were doing me a favor, when the reality was they were trying to save face. Now, I could have said no. A lot of people expected me to. They assumed I'd stick to my guns and reject the offer on principle. But here's the thing. Accepting their money wasn't giving in. It was flipping the script. They tried to force me into making changes, and when they failed, they ended up paying me to make them on my terms. That's not caving. That's winning. So I cashed the check, hired a local craftsman, replaced the weathered boards with rich, sturdy planks of cedar, added a new railing that matched the character of the house but with a bit more elegance, installed a gorgeous wooden swing that creaks just enough to remind you you're alive, put up some reclaimed furniture, potted a few succulents, and strung up warm, golden lights that twinkle just after sunset. The porch became a place not just to sit, but to be. Neighbors now pass by and wave. Visitors comment on how cozy it looks. And yes, I still sit out there every morning, coffee in hand, dogs lounging at my feet, and a grin on my face. Because here's the most delicious part of the whole ordeal. Every now and then, the same HOA lady, the one with the clipboard and the pinched expression like she hasn't smiled since dial-up internet was a thing, drives by. She always slows down just enough to look, but she never stops. We don't speak. She doesn't wave. But I always smile. Every single time. Because nothing, and I mean nothing, says victory, like enjoying a quiet moment on a beautiful new porch, paid for by the very people who tried to bully you into building it. It's not just about the money or the materials. It's about knowing who you are, standing firm when someone tries to push you, and holding your ground, not with anger, not with pettiness, but with clarity and confidence. The HOA thought they could intimidate me into submission. What they actually did was remind a whole community to read the fine print, to question authority when it overreaches, and to speak up when something smells off. I didn't back down. I didn't fold. I stayed true to myself and my property and let the absurdity of their power trip unravel itself. So yeah, I'm still here, still sipping that coffee, still swinging gently on the porch they paid for. And the next time someone tells me I need to follow a rule that doesn't apply, I'll just take another sip, smile, and enjoy the breeze, because I already know how that story ends. Thanks for watching another unbelievable story here on Beyond. Tale, where real stories go beyond the ordinary. If this tale had you shaking your head or cheering by the end, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell us your wildest neighbor or HOA experience in the comments. Until next time, keep your ground firm and your porch even firmer.